Tartarians, the greatest civilization ever to be erased from history. Another huge N.W.O, New World Order lie, the transatlantic slave trade out of Africa. So the story goes, some 12.5 million Africans were taken from their homes and forced aboard slave ships that were destined to the New World, which we know America is the old world. About 10.7 million people destined for the New World. About 10.7 million people survived the horrors of the Middle Passage between 1526 and 1866, only to end up in bondage on sugar, rice, cotton, and tobacco plantations throughout the Americas and the Caribbean. The transatlantic slave trade is the largest forced migration in history. So-called black people are indigenous to the Americas. Black Native Americans are not a result of the so-called Red Indian mixing with slaves. The so-called Red Indian comes from the mixing with the European colonists and the Asians that were in the Americas before Columbus. The first Native Americans were Mongolian Tartarians. Melville Hertzkovitz, if I'm pronouncing it right, a European anthropologist, was one of the originators of the out of Africa theory. Hertzkovitz never had any historical, archaeological, or any anthropological proof that black people of the Americas ever derived from West and North Africa. Consequently, Hertzkovitz crafted the theory that blacks arrived in America from the transatlantic slave trade, which allegedly brought in more than 10 million African slaves. According to the National Archives of Spain and the Smithsonian records, there was no evidence to prove 70,000 ships with black Africans ever sailed to the Americas. Melville carried out the teachings of his mentor, Franz Boas, pronouncing it right, to make the original copper-colored races of the Americas inferior and the European presence superior. Before this time, blacks coming from Africa through the transatlantic slave trade story never existed. Something to think about. As a result, Melville's work has been fragmented and used as propaganda by writers like Harold Kurlander and Alex Haley, which further perpetuated the myth of the transatlantic slave trade through the hit movie Roots. And it's called Tell You a Vision, television. Okay. So right here we have the transatlantic imports by region, 1415 through 1900. Brazil, number of slaves accounted for 4 million, 2.5 to 1.6, 500,000. The Dutch West Indies, Danish West Indies, and Europe and the islands. Okay. Americas were black people, and they were not brought here on ships. Instead, they were enslaved right here on their own lands. Instead, they were enslaved right here on their own lands and reclassified as Negroes and other terms as well. Okay. If they were brought on ships, the numbers are extremely exaggerated. It was published that 15 million to 20 million slaves arrived in the Americas between 1540 and 1850 over a 310-year period, according to the U.S. books. The Stewart synopsis points out a few questions that should be examined. Number one, over a period of 300 years, is it fair to say that 60,000 slaves were transported annually to the Americas, or has the transportation of slaves to the Americas been one big myth? Number two, the largest seagoing vessel carried 400 slaves, but not all of the slave ships were that large. Okay. Number three, time of passage was 3 to 4 months. That means 200 vessels / ships per year would have to travel carrying 300 people. One ship could make 3 passages per year. The transatlantic slave trade database says there were 1,100 to 1,400 voyages made over that 300-year period. If that was the case, and each ship carried 400 people, the total number would be 560,000 Africans were transported. It still does not add up. We already know that over 83% of all Americans with African ancestry have Native American blood. Okay, number 5. Did Native American tribes, slaves escape, or were Americans with African ancestries already part of a Native American nations? Okay. After 20 years of the Royal Adventurer with its 15 ships had transported between 90,000 and 100,000 slaves. That is a long way from 15 million to 20 million slaves who were supposedly brought to the Americas. Doesn't that leave a little over 14 million to 19 million people not accounted for? What's up with that? Or was the black-brown birth rate that more accelerated than the white birth rate? The calculated median of 15 to 20 million would be 17.5. Divide it by 400 people, the largest slave vessels. That comes out to 43,750 ships. Can you show me a record where this many trips occurred, or the number of trips calculated by the so-called experts? Figures exist of 27,000 through 35,000 voyages. The same thing happened with the Holocaust in Germany during World War II. 6 million people were supposedly killed, but there are not that many names referenced who died, totaling 6 million. In fact, the official story has reduced the number to 1 million people. Stewart synopsis lists these black native tribes: the Washita of the Louisiana/Midwest, the Yemasees of the Southeast, excuse me if I butcher some of these words, the Iroquois, the Cherokee Indians, the Blackfoot Indians, the Pequot and Mohegans of Connecticut, the Black Californians, okay? California literally means black, B-L-A-K. The Olmecs of Mexico, and the Daronite of Panama. I probably butchered that word. But you see, they're saying they crammed all these slaves, African, Negroid people into ships. I don't believe it, okay?